On today's show, a true 78er who fought for our rights in Australia so we can all live the way we live today within the LGBTI community during a time where being a homosexual was a criminal act and judged and ostracised by the community, but also the police who were there to protect you. Barry Charles, welcome to LGBTI Conversations.
Great to be with you, Anthony.
Now, you grew up in Punchbowl in the 50s and 60s. Can you paint a bit of a picture of what it was like back then growing up?
Oh, yes, suburban Punchbowl. It was a very working class area and there was no kind of excitement or anything. And growing up gay in that area was, you just had absolutely no visible gay community. You didn't know where there could possibly be one. And you just had to find your own way as a youth to just realise that he liked other boys and was quite confident by the time I was 17 that nothing else was going to happen. I just had to find some men to connect with.
Now, when did you realise that you started to have feelings for other guys?
From a very early age. I mean, around those days, they used to give you sex education at a father and son night, 14 or something, which is far too late in my opinion. And they said, this is how it all works with girls and boys. And then they said, you may have feelings about another boy at this stage of your life, but don't worry about it. You'll grow out of it. And of course, I just thought about that for quite a long period and just thought, no, this is not going away. I just feel like that.
Because in the 50s, it was a pretty conservative time. I suppose we woke up a little bit more in the 60s. It was a bit more about free love. But in the 50s, it was still very woman, man, and that was about it.
Yeah, it definitely was. As I say, my teenage years were in the 60s, and someone in that area, out in the Bankstown area, I saw recently you interviewed Carla from Bankstown, and it was interesting to find out that a couple of generations on, not very much has changed. And so, as I say, I knew I was homosexually attracted, and I basically waited until I was out in the real world when I got a job when I was 18 and found what was happening in the city.
And once you did turn 18 and obviously start working, I suppose your world opened up a lot more with interactions with other gay guys?
Well, of course, again, it was still like a secret society type thing, and it was very difficult to know where to go. And so the first thing I discovered was the public toilets and parks and so on, where you could, have sex on the spot with another man.
During that time too, we've got to realise that homosexuality was a crime still.
Yep, a very, very serious crime. The act of buggery, as it was called in the actual legislation, was subject to imprisonment of 14 years. So from a very early time, as soon as I saw in late 1970 that there was a gay rights organisation, wasn't called gay in those days, we were CAMP in those days, CAMP. And there was an organisation forming that was going to try and change those laws, and I wanted to be part of that straight away.
Because you were one of the first members of CAMP. Can you tell us a bit more about what that organisation stood for?
Sure. CAMP was the Campaign Against Moral Persecution. So the acronym CAMP was also, as I say, the phrase that homosexual people called themselves in those days. To be camp and behave camp was to be effeminate and flamboyant and so on. That was the general concept of what a gay person was. And so the Campaign Against Moral Persecution was formed it started having its regular meetings and everything in early 1971. And advertisement appeared in the University of New South Wales student newspaper advertising that there would be a campus camp and their first meeting would be on such and such a date. This is about February or March 1971. And I went to that and I walked into the room and there were two guys there and I was the third one to join that group. And over time, we grew it into a group of about 30 people.
So are people still scared to come out and go to meetings like this, considering all the backlash they could get themselves in if they were found out to be gay or lesbian?
Yes, indeed. Most of the gay community had their bars. There were a couple of bars in Sydney and a club did drag shows and that type of thing at night. But they weren't comfortable in that setting, but they didn't want to cause any trouble or any stir and so on. So those who wanted to actually change things and change the laws and get out there and be visible in the general community were virtually a small, brave band of people.
Understand too, the older generation back in the 70s, they were used to being homosexual as a crime and they were happy to lay low and just get on with their lives. They didn't want any trouble. And I suppose they looked at these younger generation that they're a bit of a troublemaker and they were kind of causing a bit of a scene. And the older generation didn't want anything like that.
It's sad to say that that is largely true. And that went on right through the 70s and 80s as gay activism, gay liberation and so on did street marches and zaps, as we used to call them in those days, where we suddenly appear in Martin Place or something in the city and start dancing around in a circle and shouting 2468, gay is just as good as straight. And that older generation, as I say, were a bit frightened about what direction that would go to, whether it would cause a huge backlash.
Because again, your whole life was going to get disrupted if you were found out to be gay or lesbian, and more so gay. I think during that time there was a big focus on that, and that, you know, you could lose your job, you could have all your details printed in the paper, which sounds absolutely crazy today, but this was happening.
Absolutely. When we had a major gay rights demonstration, the first actual big one in 1973, and there were about 20 or 30 people arrested. All those people had their names published the following Tuesday morning, I think, in the Sydney Morning Herald, gave their full name, the suburb where they lived, and their occupation. Now, of course, for some people who were teachers or had public service jobs or anything like that, it was disastrous for them.
And did you come across anything like that, anyone you knew or yourself having that happen to you?
I worked for a firm of chartered accountants at the time, so I was out everywhere else but not there. Around about that time, I realised that, you know, that environment that I worked in was not the place for me to even want to be part of. So I ended up getting a job at the telephone exchange for the Postmaster General's department, and that was an interesting place because it was a mainly female workforce in the telephone exchange, but there were about 30 guys and most of them were gays. My work position was quite, secure.
Now that takes us on to the very first Sydney Mardi Gras. Tell us a bit about what you remember of that all coming together.
I wasn't actually involved in the lead up to the first Mardi Gras, as I was overseas and getting a lot of experience of gay protests and so on in San Francisco and seeing the achievements they'd made in New York. But I got back to Sydney and some friends and activists that I'd known way back early 1970s said, "Oh, we're having a gay rights weekend," because it was June 1978, and by then gay rights organisations all over the world were commemorating Stonewall, which was the 1969 demonstration and riot in New York. So they said, "We're having this event," and they said there'll be an ordinary political march during the day, but on the night we're going to have a party. We're going to make it a party, and we're going to go down Oxford Street and try to attract as many people out of the bars and the chant was out of the bars onto the street. So that was what was planned, and that's what we got a permit to do.
Because there was actually a permit that said you were able to have a protest, but something went seriously wrong towards the end of that protest.
Yeah, the permit was very good, and as I say, it was for a kind of party, not a great deal of costumes like you see these days, or certainly not floats, but we had a truck playing music and some people dressed up a bit and there were balloons and what have you. And the permit allowed us to go down Oxford Street, Darlinghurst Road, Green Park. Had the permit took us going downhill Oxford Street on the right-hand side of the road and into Hyde Park and have a small rally there, and then that would be the end of it. But as I say, the object was to create a party at Oxford Street in those days, which by then had a few bars and clubs and so on. And we got to the bottom of Oxford Street and the police were becoming increasingly agitated and at the amount of traffic disruption this was causing. It was a Saturday night, so what did they expect? But anyway, so they decided to terminate the parade before we could actually get into Hyde Park. They said, "Disperse now." Now, that wasn't really possible because we had paddy wagons behind us, we had police beside us, and we had this huge cordon of police across the entrance to Hyde Park, where the cannon is now. So the only alternative was that, and some of the leading people, mostly the women actually, always the first to fire up, they said, "To the cross." And they literally just took off down College Street and ran all the way up William Street and into Darlinghurst Road at King's Cross, where the real confrontations occurred because the police had increased their numbers by then, and they just grabbed people out of the crowd and put them into the backs of paddy wagons. And the police action was very violent.
And what were happening to these people that were getting taken away?
They were taken to various police stations around the city, but the main one in those days was Phillip Street Police Station, which no longer exists, but it's a police museum now, and it's down near Circular Quay. And they were locked up, and others were taken back to Darlinghurst Police Station. I wasn't one of the arrestees, and I had dropped out of the whole thing in College Street because I had traumatic personal situation. When they were taken into Darlinghurst Police Station, they were actually subject to assaults and so on by the police officers. So it was a very, very ugly situation, and people gathered, outside the police station, Darlinghurst Police Station, which is just there near Taylor Square in between Burke Street, opposite the Sydney Art School. There were assaults occurring, and people were outside listening to some of the screams and so on from inside until they could get people released on bail.
And once they were released, did their details get published like other offenders?
Exactly the same as 1973, when they appeared in court on the Monday morning down at Liverpool Street Court, where again, demonstrations to show what the community thought of this. But as I say, I think it probably was, again, the Tuesday morning that the Sydney Morning Herald published all the names of the arrestees, where there were quite a lot more than in my previous demonstrations. And the same thing, name, occupation, identify them, the suburb where they lived as well.
So a lot of lives would have been blown apart through that alone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I say, we knew of lots of friends who then we had to support in other ways. We had to help them deal with being terminated from their jobs and so on. Yep.
Now, you were saying you were coming back from the US where you saw some activism happening over there. What was going on during that period over in America?
What had happened is that between 1969 and 1978, there'd been quite a lot of advances in anti-discrimination ordinances being passed, mainly by cities and local government areas. As happens, there was also a political backlash against those. And the religious right, I always hesitate to call them the religious right because they're really just right-wing politicians exploiting the ignorance of many religious people who don't understand the real world. And anyway, these people, the famous ones were Anita Bryant, Jerry Falwell, and these people were putting on ballot a rescinding notice so that people voted to rescind the anti-discrimination and pro-gay laws that had been introduced. And this was happening all over the United States. When I arrived in San Francisco, such a thing had just happened that night, on a Tuesday night, in the state of Oregon. And the 9 o'clock news crossed to the corner of Castro and Market Streets in San Francisco, and there was a big demonstration forming right there. So as I say, it wasn't their community directly, but they out in force to express their disapproval of what was happening up north. I joined that demonstration, and it marched all the way to the City Hall in San Francisco when the rally was addressed by Harvey Milk, the San Francisco City Board of Governors and out gay activist at the time. That was so exciting, and it showed me that there were about 2,000 to 3,000 people in that Tuesday night demonstration, which showed me how big a community could be and how powerful it could be. And so when I got back to Sydney and told what was happening here, having been around for so many years, since 1971, got to bring that here.
And did you ever think that we'd get as far as the US was getting at that time when you did come back to Australia and you did see some movement happening? Did you think, okay, here we go?
I knew it was still going to be a huge fight and that we had to expand the number of people who were activists and getting the community inspired. as I say, get the people out of the bars and into the streets and to actually start fighting for their rights. So we had to build and build and build, and we worked on that for many, many years. It was 1981 when we formed Gay Rights Lobby, which was an actual group, again, that was going to the individual politicians and proposing an actual piece of legislation that they could support. Took a great deal of effort in the early 80s.
Now, you were saying you call yourself a bit of a beat queen. I've read that in a few articles, so I hope that's correct.
Yeah, I'm very proud of it, because I think that finding your way as a gay man and finding just how free and adventurous our sexuality can be is just as important to me as any kind of legal changes and that sort of thing. And I think we should be proud of the fact that our sexuality is not the same, it's different, but absolutely equal.
Because during that time too, around the beats, it was a dangerous place. It could be very dangerous. There was, as we're learning more and more now, it was very easy to get bashed.
Yeah, there were two things that you had to watch out for at Beats, and that was bashers, and I became very aware of that as early as 1971. And the other thing was police actions, because we've spoken about the criminality of homosexuality, and so the police were very adamant that they would stamp out anything. And so if you were discovered at a beat or so on, you were treated very harshly by the police.
Did you ever come in contact with the people who were assaulting people, or were you assaulted during any times at any of the beats?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got several incidents either that I witnessed or that I actually experienced. We're talking over a long period from about 1971 to 1987, 88. I was assaulted about, I've been trying to calculate exactly how many, but it's probably in the area of 4 or 5 cases. And I witnessed about another 4 or 5 where I wasn't the victim but saw what was happening.
And the thing is, what could you actually do? Because the police were kind of in on it as well, as you couldn't go there because it was a crime to be gay. So you really had no one to go to.
Yep. Even when we move up into the 1980s, when there was a sizable gay community on Oxford Street and there was a quite substantial rise in actual street violence rather than just beat violence. But if people went to the police station, the police would say, we're not investigating that, but what were you doing there? And we could arrest you if we wanted to, and that kind of stuff. So you were very wary of doing anything like that.
So for the police that were there to protect actually was doing the opposite during that time for the homosexual community.
Exactly. They weren't protecting us equally under the law. And so co-conveners of Gay Rights Lobby, myself and Robert French, visited the police minister. One of the suggestions that I had was that we create a police gay liaison unit where police officers would sit down and with community representatives and try to see where we were coming from, try to see that the world was changing, social changes were inevitable, and that they just needed to adjust to that. And surprisingly, the police minister at the time, this is 1982, was Mr. Peter Anderson, and he had just come back from a study tour in the United States and spent time with the police commander in San Francisco. And he said, I saw that in San Francisco. That's really good. He said, I think we should try and have that here. But he said, well, I've got to change the culture. And of course, in 82, we were still the serious criminals.
It wasn't until 1984 that became decriminalised. Do you remember that time? And do you remember how you felt when you heard that it was okay to be gay?
Well, that's right. Gay Rights Lobby had pushed for that law reform for a long time. We'd had about 3 or 4 previous attempts, or 2 or 3 previous attempts, which weren't satisfactory change. But and so we were all there, either outside the Parliament or in the gallery on the night that those laws were passed. And it was after, in my case, 13 or 14 years of fighting. It was an amazing relief. There were still some flaws and some regrets that legislation had a couple of real serious problems with it, but it really did feel like we'd finally achieved something. At
least you knew that your details weren't going to be published and you weren't a criminal if you were caught.
Yeah, even the Sydney Morning Herald had realised that they should never have taken that action. It took them another 20 years to actually publish an apology for what they did in the 1970s, but we were getting somewhere at last.
Baby steps, better than no steps at all.
Yeah.
And take us to the current day. The Special Commission inquiry into the LGBTIQ hate crimes has been another step forward. And I think they were focusing on the 1970s to 2010, which is relevantly recent, which is pretty scary to think that a lot of these hate crimes were still happening right up till then.
Oh, yes. Look, that's what the mistake people might feel, that, we feel we've achieved so much with marriage equality and all these things, and you can be in a gay community in the inner city and feel that, you're not under any threat. But honestly, there's undocumented violence still going on in the outer suburbs and so on. You've got communities out there and working class people who still can't have the confidence to come out. So they're still doing beats, or they're still faced not being able to come out to their families for all various reasons. And so in those areas, we're very foolish if we think this stuff still doesn't happen.
Was part of the commission, and you actually spoke. Can you tell us a bit about what you spoke about during the commission?
Sure. The main aspect that was why I was asked to do that is that we found that even today, the lawyers and the commission itself still doesn't understand a lot about the nature of being homosexual in those early days. How you had to, as I said earlier, find your own way. How it was kind of a secret community, and we developed our own norms of behaviour and so on away from the structure of heterosexual society. And so it became, my role was to go there and explain that culture. And I was quite frank and open and out about what beats were like and how they work and how people came together and what have you. And I just think that needs to be widely known.
Now, talking about beats, fast forwarding to 2023, and also the modern nation of dating apps or hookup apps like Grindr, the two worlds have collided. But as you were saying, it seems like the beats are still alive and well, mixed with this new modern age of apps.
Yeah, they're not alive and well. I mean, many were being closed down over the years, and there is, in the city areas and so on, no real need to go to those places anymore. But as I say, go out to the suburbs and go out country towns, they still do exist.
Do you think we've lost anything with the apps like Grindr around today?
Personally, they wouldn't suit me. I've never gone on Grindr or anything, and my impression of what it is spending hours flicking left and right and then going through a huge conversation about, would you be up for this and blah, 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 and then arranging a meeting and then waiting and then texting again to find out that their grandmother's cousin's husband has died and they've got to go to the funeral or something. That sort of hookup is fraught with difficulties, whereas the old days were a lot more immediate, let me tell you.
We've got something to learn. There is something from the past that maybe we can learn a little bit more from. And as you say, the modern age is a lot of what you said, and it's I suppose in a lot of cases, a lot of people think, it's a time waster because you've got to go through all these hoops and then nothing happens. When
you have that sort of separation between, going to be blunt, the lust and the action. Before we had personal columns in the newspapers where people would describe who they were and what age they were and what have you, and you had to write a letter and respond, and the letter had to go through the newspaper and then out to the addressee and all. And the amount of time wasted on trying to hook up was ridiculous.
That's interesting. The old personal ads, I think everyone has nearly forgotten about them. Did you ever try anything like that, trying to meet up with someone through a personal ad?
Oh, yeah. And I described it was about a 1 in 10 chance that even if they replied that you actually something end up happening.
You probably moved 3 months ago when the letter got to you.
Yes, indeed.
Now, how do you feel about where we are today? We've decriminalised homosexuality. We now have marriage equality. Plus, a lot of other things have happened for the community throughout the years. What's your view on it?
I think it's enormous advance. and it's wonderful, but don't think it's secure. You have the situation in America just recently where after 30-something years, a piece of legislation that is part of basic women's and human rights, abortion laws and so on have been rescinded, reversed. One of the justices of the Supreme Court in the United States said, now I think we should relook at gay marriage. So we've got to constantly be on the lookout for moves like that. I think we have something to be very proud of here, and we're going to have World Pride here, probably going to be one of the most important World Prides ever, because it's here in the Southern Hemisphere and it's here in the Asia-Pacific region, and that we have a very important role to set an example for what can be achieved to communities in Asia and the Pacific Islands.
Well, I suppose when you look at it, it's like the Gay Olympics, really. World Pride 2023 in Sydney. It's going to be pretty big.
Yes, it is going to be as spectacular as we hoped. I mean, I went to New York in 2019 to promote and to try and win the bid to bring it here. And I saw what New York can be. And of course, Copenhagen, the last one, was held during COVID. So it wasn't as spectacular as everyone had hoped. So we've got the chance to really bring it back as a really important and major influence in the world.
And one thing Australia is known for is doing things well. So I'm sure this won't be any different.
As I say, there's the central events, which are important, but been checking the website and particularly the World Pride Amplified site for all the community groups and the spontaneous things that are going to be popping up. They are what really makes it that the communities, all the different type gay organisations that we have, from sporting clubs to social clubs to counselling services and what have you. There's such a huge variety of things that people get behind will be enormous.
And are you going to participate in anything?
Oh, absolutely. I'm 72, planning to be in the World Pride Bridge Walk. I'll certainly be in Mardi Gras Parade as usual in the 78er's group. I'll try to get to as many other events. I'm also involved with Sydney Harbour Bears, so I will be at their events. It's a real opportunity for me to be reinvigorated. 72
years young, you're basically a spring chicken.
Look, I felt like it lately, Anthony, because the Special Commission was a wonderful experience. I've never felt so supported, and that by the lawyers assisting the Commission. I had a real spring in my step over the last couple of weeks, and so I'm really looking forward to next year.
And I think also it's important that we do pay respects to our elders like yourself, who's done so much for the community, that we as younger generations live with our partners and marry our partners and just have a normal life like we always wanted. And it's all thanks to your generation who made this all possible. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for that.
Really appreciate it, Anthony. And as I say, we weren't heroes. We were just doing what we had to do, and which I hope everyone will do if we have to have those fights again.
Now, something we like to ask all our guests, if you could go back and tell your younger self anything, what would it be?
Oh, I know it's difficult now, but just hang in there. All going to work out. It's all going to come together. And that's the story that I would tell my 17-year-old self.
Barry Charles, thank you so much for coming on LGBTI Conversations. It's been a pleasure.
Great pleasure, and thank you very much, Anthony.
If you love listening to LGBTI Conversations, make sure to follow. This will help other people find us much easier. And also, make sure that you never miss out on an episode. Thanks for listening to LGBTI Conversations with me, Anthony Doik.